Today is a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of sort of a workshop on a style of yoga that is sometimes referred to as flow and restore, sometimes referred to as yin and yang. The name sort of changes depending on where you are, the studio, or the teacher. So what it is essentially is sort of mostly a flow type class with a restorative type posture or two, or sometimes yin type posture or two at the end of practice before Shavasana. So I will be looking down to the corner to read my notes for this. So if you see my eyes darting down now and again, I'm just checking out what I wrote because my memory is not as great as maybe it used to be. I would suggest if you're sort of playing along with this session today, then you might want to grab a couple of props if you have them, either the actual props or substitutes. So 2 blocks for sure. If you don't have blocks, you could use cushions or like those flat chip foam blocks, or a couple of folded over blankets perhaps, but hopefully you have 2 blocks. This is kind of the bare minimum that we might want for this practice. So if you have this at least, then you can play around with some of the setup. I won't go through all the multitude of props that you could have, but if you've got a bolster or a blanket close by too, then that will be super helpful as well. Just when we get to sort of, I'll show you how you can maybe like set up these relaxing restorative yin type poses in an easy way. So we'll dive in. So like I just said, it's just a little bit of a demo and a little bit of a chat about this style that I really like to teach. Yoga styles vary greatly around the world. So this might have a different name where you are. Maybe it's not a thing where you are, and this is a totally new kind of combination style. But I really like this type of practice because it's kind of a little bit of 2 opposing styles together. So students get to experience not only sort of a dynamic yang type flow practice, which is usually around, let's say this is an hour class, it's probably going to be around 35 minutes to 40 minutes of the flow style practice, and then 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 1 or 2 relaxing restorative type poses, and then a Shavasana. That's Diego just clicking by his feet. So lots of students, when you go to a yoga studio, sometimes the classes are really distinct. Like here's a flow class at 10 o'clock, here's a restorative class at 7 p.m., here's a yin class at 9 p.m. There's not sometimes often a lot of overlap. So these sort of practices that draw on other styles to create this different type practice altogether is a good way to introduce students to this type of thing. So if you were a teacher who taught flow classes and restorative classes, then maybe you can introduce a restorative pose or 2 in your flow classes to get those flow students who may not have been introduced to restorative yoga or yin yoga, just give them a sense of what that might look like. It's a really relaxing type practice because we are moving moderately intensively, depending on the type of flow practice you're teaching for, a good portion of the class. And then it's like this extra long relaxing ending of the class. So in addition to Shavasana, we have this other nice slow way of kind of relaxing the body, relaxing the mind. This is very helpful for students who have difficulty relaxing. So if you are or know of a student for whom like a restorative or yin class as a whole is just not possible. They just can't be still for that long. They just get really agitated and a little bit antsy with all the quiet and all the setup and all those things. then this is a nice introduction to that whole world. It gives them an opportunity to move, to get that energy moved and used up, and then we take that and we invite them into these relaxing poses where hopefully it just takes things down a couple of notches. So I find it really helpful for this specific type of student. And to be honest, for some people, Shavasana can be quite short. In an hour-long class, you know, depending on the time you have available and the expectation of how long Shavasana will be, sometimes it feels kind of short. So if we're able to extend Shavasana or this relaxing type ending to a class in creative ways that feel interesting, then we can help our students to kind of access these deeper levels of relaxation and calm. So it can be really great for that as well. Just bearing in mind this pose or two poses that we're including, or maybe three, depending on how you decide to sequence this, they're not restorative poses per se. They might look similar, but the intention might be different. The setup might have to be different based on the props you have available and the number of people who you have in your class. And they're also not maybe yin type poses either. They might not be traditionally yin or traditionally restorative. They might look exactly the same. Maybe the setup's the same, that's great, but sometimes we have to be a little different. And by being different and using different props, that might change the amount of time that we choose to stay in the poses. So just bearing this in mind. If you are super curious about restorative yoga and learning more about restorative yoga, then I would encourage you to check out the restorative training that we have, because that's going to go really, really deep into this beautiful style of yoga that is accessible, calming, and relaxing. So we're just bringing in a little bit of that intention into a flow or even a hatha class just at the end. So it really does just all come down to the intention that we have. So some things to keep in mind. If to be honest, if I'm teaching this class and it's a flow and restore class and it's a 60-minute class, I want to be really mindful of the amount of props that I'm using. So generally in a restorative class, a full restorative class, we probably are going to have 2 blocks, 1 or 2 bolsters, maybe 2 blankets if you have it, strap, chip foam blocks. Like, we just gather as many things as we can so that we have the option to support the poses in all the different ways. The rule generally, or an idea generally, is it's better to have more props in a restorative yoga class than less, because you don't want to have to be getting up and getting props or handing out props throughout the whole class. So it's good just to have everything available. In this type of class, if we're teaching a flow class, there's like 35 people, well, there's probably not space for 2 bolsters, 2 blocks, 7 blankets, or whatever it is that you might need. So depending on what the studio or your teaching space has available, likely 2 blocks. This is great. You can make it work with 1 block, but 2 blocks is awesome. And that might be the bare minimum. In a packed class, there's not going to be room for all these props around. We want to keep it neat and tidy, I think. So 2 blocks is the minimum. If it's possible, I might suggest as well a bolster or bolster substitute. So my bolster substitute is a lovely rolled up blanket, and that's it. Maybe that's it. There'll be people who grab their familiar props. Some students will be used to having a blanket for the knees, things like that, but just, you know, keeping it sort of simple if possible, but with options. And then I find that this type of practice, for me, works really great when I can incorporate the restorative type poses that I'm using into the sequence as a whole. So I found personally that a theme for my class of heart opening works really well, and I'll show you the pose that I use for that type of theme. Grounding as a theme works really well for this type of practice. And also, I've taken a flow and restore class that was centered around hips, and that felt really nice in my body as well. So the restorative pose is usually the last pose or last 2 poses, I would say, before Shavasana. And, you know, depending on the shapes that I'm choosing, I can offer for students to stay in that pose longer in place of Shavasana if they choose to. The example that I'll give is if I'm doing like a floating legs up the wall. And for some people who have difficulty lying flat on the mat, that might be a nice option to continue doing instead of coming into Shavasana. But these poses are generally sort of towards the end of class because we're sort of tapping into that slow, calming energy. And then by the time we're in Shavasana, we are hopefully quite relaxed and able to be still and enjoy it, which is part of the idea behind it. So the other thing to just mention is that we really want to be mindful of the energetic flow of this type of practice. So it's not like we're flowing along in this like super awesome flow for 40 minutes and then we just bang stop, restorative pose. As sequencers of yoga classes, being very mindful about the tempo of the yoga class. So how does it start? What's the sort of peak of the yoga class, of the flow? And then how will I start to bring the energy slowly down so it's not abrupt, that we're sort of gently encouraging our students as we move through the class to begin to find these sort of opposing types of energy. So there's very much, as we talk about in the training, there's very much an arc to this. So one thing that can sometimes happen when we're sequencing these classes is we're used to sequencing a 60-minute flow class. So we have a lot of postures, we're moving quite quickly. When we're reducing the amount of time we have available for flow, we want to be really mindful that we're not overpacking this so that the transition feels quite smooth and natural. What's that going to look like? That's a great question. Let's see. So say, for example, I'm going to do, you have to imagine that this was like a sped up yoga class. So I'm going to go through sort of some of the elements. So I might start seated. The reason that I might start seated for this flow and restore class is that I know I'm going to spend a little bit of time on my back towards the end of class. So just nice to start seated to begin with. I'm going to sit up on a block. And then maybe you start with a opening meditation or a pranayama, just something nice, settling and grounding so students can arrive. And then you might do some neck stretches or some seated things here just to sort of wake up the body. And then I might transition to hands and knees. So I'm coming to tabletop, and just a nice simple one to do here is cat-cow, because this gets us to connect with the idea of connecting movement and breath together. Oh, can't see my head there. So then we might do this, and then maybe downward dog is a nice option. And then I might break down a vinyasa to begin with here, just to get students used to what that might look like. So coming to plank or half plank, and then slowly lowering down to the mat with mindful control, and then maybe exploring a little bit of baby cobra or cobra, and then coming back to hands and knees or plank, and then maybe downward dog. And then you might start getting into a little bit more movement at this point. Maybe you're stepping forward or back, and then we're maybe coming up to stand, and then we might start to do a few sun salutations, either sun salutation A or maybe B, or a variation there within. And so we're flowing and we're moving with the breath, we're getting that energy going, and you're moving through a few rounds of sun salutations. Maybe say you're doing like 3 here, and then you might come back to downward dog and start looking at a couple of standing poses, maybe lunges or warrior 1, these kind of things. And then you're sort of building the energy up to what might be your peak, whether it's an energetic peak or a peak pose. And it's a short class, so maybe your peak pose is triangle, or maybe dancer's pose or something like that that fits with your theme. And then, so say we're at like 30 minutes now, and we've got to 30-ish minutes, we've got to sort of the pinnacle of the flow type movement. Then we probably will want to start bringing things down a little bit. So we're finding a way to come down on the mat to start to bring the energy down. That might be, maybe you'll explore a pigeon pose on each side, or you might come to a child's pose. And so we're just thinking about super consciously moving the body down towards the ground and very mindfully starting to bring the energy down at the same time. So child's pose, lovely here. And then a really nice option is to come to a seated pose or two. So I love butterfly, Baddha Konasana, butterfly forward fold, or could be the half butterfly forward fold. Just gonna check here. These are options, really, really lovely. And so then now, maybe we're like, on a good day, 35 minutes, maybe 40 if we're a little pushing closer towards the 40-minute mark of the class. And then we arrive at the place where we can start to think about coming down into our first or our only restorative pose. So one option is that for the seated pose, so you might choose to do a restorative version. This is really helpful if you have bolsters, but it's okay if you don't, because then it's a little bit more yin-like. But we could take what's known as a turtle pose in restorative yoga, or a yin butterfly, where the heels are further away, so it's more of a diamond shape between the hips and the heels. You can support the knees or the thighs with blocks or bolsters maybe, and I like to just have a block or two out in front of me. And then you're just starting to slowly fold forward. What makes this different is we're supporting the head if possible here. So I might stack my blocks one on top of the other here, because then I can rest my head down. And your students might need to keep quite a bit of length in their spine, so propped up a little higher. So maybe here, or maybe they can round the spine a little bit as comfortable, depending on them and their bodies. And this is just a way to kind of start this process of relaxing. So if your theme was hips, this is a great hip. A nice relaxed yin restorative type hip opening shape. And we're resting here for maybe a few minutes. And I would encourage you just to kind of to try before you taught this, to sort of see how long you think feels appropriate for you and your students. You'll definitely get a sense of it when you do it, so kinesthetically you'll know. But a couple of minutes is nice, and encourage students that they can come out of it if they need to, or explore a different variation. But this is just a good way to start to kind of slow down. And we're not down on the back yet, but we're sort of getting there. And then my favorite one to do on the back. So now we're coming down onto the back, and the thing to be aware of is we probably don't want to have to come all the way back up and do any seated poses. If we're on the back, it'd be nice just to sort of slip into Shavasana as possible, but we're using props, so likely we'll have to come up to remove the props and then come down again, so that's okay. You might be familiar with this. This is sometimes kind of a common prop use for a supported back bend. Now, if this was restorative yoga, we'd likely be using a bolster here, and you can. So the bolster just comes behind you. Hopefully you can see that. And this is a rolled up blanket, but a bolster is probably going to be a little bit thicker. And you come to sit with the bolster right at your low back, and then slowly lowering down over the bolster. The head coming down on the bolster. And one option is the feet coming into butterfly, or the legs opening out wide or straight out in front, and the arms out by the sides. This is an awesome, beautiful hip opening shape, heart opening shape, sorry. So a really nice pose choice if your theme is heart opening. And then the other option for this, it's a little bit more intense, so the time that you stay here might be less, or there's ways of using the block that can sort of modify the amount of intensity a student may be feeling. We're all different, we all feel things differently, but just based on the height of the blocks, you can kind of play around. So one way would be to bring one block lengthwise along your mat, so your spine will be resting over this block, the other block at the top of your mat for your head. So the blocks will look like this. And then, I think you can see that there. And then I will lie down slowly over the block, And it's going to go sort of between my shoulder blades, at my mid-back to the space between my shoulder blades. It's following the length of my spine, and then my head is resting on that other block. And then just like with the bolster, the arms opening out wide, maybe a little closer. It might feel better for some. Leg variations, butterfly like straight or out wide. And this is really nice. For some students, this block along the shoulder blades, that's a lot. So you might take this block and bring it flat and across the mat. And then this block will sort of go in around the same area, but maybe a little bit lower down on the body. And then you're resting down over this block. It's sort of at the tips of the shoulder blades. And then the other block probably also flat to rest the head on. Could be on any height that works here. So there's a little bit less intensity with this variation. So this one is with this block flat along the mid-back, and then this block for the head. It's another option. So definitely play around with this, because it's just really interesting to sort of see in your own body how this feels. So again, for this heart opening shape, we've got option maybe 1 would be a bolster along the spine. Option 2 might be the blocks in this configuration, head here, spine along here, or maybe a little lower down, we've got one block flat and across the mat and the other block for the head. Just possibilities. You might have a different way to do this, because there's so many ways that we can explore these, and this is amazing, this is great. And then to come out, it's tricky sometimes, but I would encourage students, once they're in this, they could bend their knees, they could roll very carefully to one side and then take a block out, or you might encourage them to come up to seated, just really mindfully supporting the head if they need to here. And then coming back down onto the back, and then you're coming into Shavasana. So I would say if you're unfamiliar with teaching this type of thing, maybe an easier way to do this, like have a restorative pose, restorative type pose before Shavasana, is a floating legs up the wall, which is my favorite. It's so easy to set up. You just need a block or a blanket or a bolster. And then with your students down on their back, then sort of imagining you were coming into bridge pose. So you're down on the back, your feet are on the mat, and then you press into the feet, pick up the hips, and slide that prop under the hips. So it's supported bridge, which is great on its own. Some students might stay here, or you might start to bring the legs in towards you and then extend the legs up, which is amazing on its own. But the beauty here is you can play around with different shapes. You can bring the feet into like a butterfly. You can take the legs wide. I like to just encourage students to just sort of move a little bit. Some of them like to play around with the legs. Lots of possibilities. And what happens with this prop is that if you are a person, and there are a fair number of students, I would say, who have very tight hamstrings, and lying on the back and just sending the legs up is a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the core. It's a lot of work to support that upside down L shape. And so by putting a prop underneath, we take out some of the work, which is the intention. And by taking out some of that work, we give students an opportunity to rest a little more, to just sort of relax into it, to let the body soften into it. And it's a way to tap into sort of the process of everything beginning to slow and calm down. So this is great. So this floating legs up the wall, and this really works if your theme is grounding, or something along those lines. Letting go might be your theme. This is also a nice pose for that. And they're here and they're just relaxing. A nice one to do as well is to take the arms up in the same direction. I think this is sometimes called dead bug pose, but that's not a great name, but there might be a different name. But you know, the arms and legs, and we're just thinking like heavy, relaxed, just sort of suspended here for a few moments. Just letting everything relax in, and then And then cueing the students to bring the arms down, to bring the feet back down. If you're using a bolster or rolled up blanket, you might press the feet down, pick up the hips, and slide that prop forward under the thighs or the knees so it's ready for Shavasana, or taking the prop out and then coming into Shavasana. And so it's really, really simple. You've already had the flow type practice, and then you're just offering this sort of extra little relaxation moment for the body and for the mind. If you are someone who teaches restorative yoga, then an idea might be to make this like a special workshop. So you could have an hour-long flow class and a half-hour part of that, a half-hour being restorative, so it's a 90-minute workshop class. Or maybe even longer, maybe you could do 2 hours and it's, you know, an hour-long flow class followed by an hour-long restorative class if you teach restorative yoga. Just as a side note, for 200-hour or the practicums, probably not wanting to put any restorative poses in because they're not part of the curriculum for the 200-hour or 175, those programs. So this is just something to do for sort of after, when you're out there teaching and maybe you've taken a restorative course and you're thinking of looking for ways that you can incorporate all your knowledge into all the different practices that you teach. And this is just a nice way to kind of draw some of those elements in. So if you have questions, by all means pop them in the comments. This is just one way to sort of look at this style that's sometimes out there called flow and restore or yin and yang, but it can differ again from place to place and teacher to teacher, so you might have experienced it differently, which is great, or maybe it's been a similar experience for you. And the nice thing about this is it gets the mind to think creatively about sequencing. And that sort of idea about the energy of the class is important in all classes that we teach. Thinking about the smooth transition between the different parts of a class. So this is just a different way to end, but the intention for most of the classes that we teach will be the same, sort of thinking about guiding our students through the different energies required for the class so that it feels very smooth and very logical and just like a natural transition, so there's no sort of abrupt, quick changes. So our role as guides through the practice is to sort of gently move our students through the sequences, through the poses and the transitions that we create. And as always, I encourage you to create your sequence and then try it for yourself. So in some ways, you're your best student and your best teacher because you're able to try things out before you teach them. I always do that. I always like to run through my sequence before I teach, whether in quick time or real time, or maybe I just take a part of it that I haven't really taught that combination before and I just want to practice it in my body and cueing myself. And so I think the practice teaching ourselves, for some of us, is just something that we do for comfort, so that we feel confident. And especially when you're thinking about adding in new poses or things you've not taught before in public, then practice is really, really key. So thank you for joining me today. I'll be monitoring the comments if you have any questions or anything, and I will see you next time. Okay, bye.